Get the translator, billionaire Arthur Sterling screamed, his face red with fury. His billion-dollar deal was collapsing on the steps of a Geneva hotel, and his international partners from Germany, Japan, and Russia stared back at him, confused and offended. Sterling's assistants scrambled, fumbling their phones. He then turned his rage on his silent driver, Leo, who stood by the limousine door. "You! What are you good for?" "Nothing. Just another useless piece of furniture," he spat, as his entourage laughed. "I need 5 languages, and I need them now." But as the chaos peaked, Leo took a calm step forward. He looked the German investor in the eye and spoke in flawless, formal German. He then turned to the Japanese delegation and bowed slightly, addressing them in perfect Japanese. He continued in Russian, then French, and finally Mandarin, his voice steady and clear. The entire street fell silent. The arrogant billionaire froze, his mouth hanging open, as he realized the useless old man he had just humiliated was the only person in the world who could save him. The morning had begun like any other for Leo. The small apartment, nestled in a quiet, working-class district of Geneva, was filled with the scent of brewing coffee and old books. Before the sun had even touched the distant Alps, Leo was awake, his routine a silent meditation. He polished his worn-out leather shoes until they reflected the dim light of his lamp, a soft glow against the scuffs of 1,000 journeys. He ironed his simple black uniform with a precision that bordered on reverence, ensuring every crease was perfect, every button secure. This uniform was his invisibility cloak, the armor he wore to navigate a world that was not his own. On his small kitchen table, next to a half-empty cup of black coffee, lay a worn copy of Advanced Mandarin Syntax. He read a page, his lips silently forming the characters, his mind finding a quiet satisfaction in the intricate logic of the language. This was his secret world, a universe of words and cultures built within the silent confines of his own mind. His first passenger of the day was Arthur Sterling. The billionaire didn't so much enter the limousine as he did conquer it. He burst through the door that Leo held open, a storm of expensive cologne and frantic energy, already shouting into his phone. He didn't look at Leo, offered no greeting, no acknowledgement that another human being was present. He was simply an obstacle to be bypassed. Sterling threw a heavy leather briefcase onto the plush seat opposite him, the thud echoing in the pristine silence of the car. "No, you listen to me," he barked into his phone. "I don't pay you to tell me it's complicated. I pay you to make it simple. Fix it." He collapsed into the seat, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair, his frustration radiating like heat. 2 junior executives, young men in sharp suits with anxious eyes, scurried in after him. They mirrored their boss's demeanor, ignoring Leo completely as they settled in. The journey to the Intercontinental Hotel began in a tense silence, broken only by Sterling's aggressive tapping on his phone screen. Leo's eyes were on the road, his posture relaxed but alert. In the rearview mirror, he saw the reflection of a kingdom in turmoil. "The Germans are getting cold feet," Sterling suddenly announced to his executives, his voice dripping with contempt. "Hans is whining about market volatility. He needs to be reminded who's taking the real risk here." He glanced up and his eyes met Leo's in the mirror for a fraction of a second. A smirk played on his lips. "It's always the same with these Europeans. All talk, no guts. You have to hold their hands through everything." One of the young executives, a man named Marcus, laughed a little too loudly. "You'll handle it, Arthur. You always do." "Damn right, I will," Sterling shot back. "And then we have the meeting with Kenji Tanaka. Remember to bow or whatever it is they do. Honestly, the amount of time we waste on these little rituals," he shook his head in disgust. In the front seat, Leo's hands remained steady on the wheel, but a flicker of understanding crossed his mind. Sterling wasn't just being rude, he was being clumsy. He was walking into a delicate international negotiation with the grace of a sledgehammer. Leo had driven Mr. Tanaka before. He knew the man valued respect and subtlety above all else, 2 concepts entirely foreign to the man raging in the back seat. The humiliation, at first, was passive. It was in the way they spoke of multi-million-dollar deals as if he weren't there, in the way the second executive, Brian, dropped a file and irritably gestured for Leo to pick it up at the next red light. Leo did so without a word, his face a placid mask. It was in the casual cruelty of their conversation. They were talking about a new app they were developing, one that used AI to replace service jobs. Imagine, Marcus said, his voice gleaming with excitement, no more lazy doormen, no more clueless drivers who don't speak a word of English. Just seamless, efficient service. He glanced towards the driver's partition, a cruel smile on his face. Sterling grunted in approval. That's a billion-dollar idea right there. People are just tools. If you can get a better tool, you do it. For Leo, the words were not daggers. They were simply data. He filed them away, another observation in a lifetime of observations. He had learned long ago that to be offended by men like Sterling was to give them a power they did not deserve. His dignity was his own, a fortress they could not breach. He continued to drive, the car gliding silently through the pristine streets of Geneva. He knew the German form market volatility was marked Volatilitat, and that Sterling's pronunciation would likely be an insult. He knew that the Japanese concept of nemawashi, the informal consensus building before a formal meeting, was something Sterling was about to violate in the most spectacular fashion. He was the only person in the vehicle who truly understood the disaster that was brewing, and he was the one person nobody would ever think to ask. As they pulled into the grand, sweeping driveway of the hotel, the tension in the car had reached a fever pitch. A group of stern-faced men and women were waiting on the steps. Leo recognized them instantly from news reports: the German industrialist, the Japanese tech mogul, the Russian investor. They were not smiling. Sterling burst out of the car before Leo could even open the door, his executive scrambling behind him. "Hans! Kenji! Glad you could make it," he boomed, his voice jarringly loud in the refined atmosphere. He clapped the German man on the shoulder, a gesture that made the man flinch. He gave the Japanese delegation a clumsy, exaggerated bow that was more mockery than respect. The air grew thick with unspoken disapproval. The deal was already dying, right here on the pavement. The disaster unfolded in slow motion. Sterling, oblivious to the icy reception, tried to seize control. "All right, let's not waste time with pleasantries," he said, pulling out his state-of-the-art smartphone. He tapped on a cheap translation app, the kind tourists use to order coffee. "My team tells me you have concerns," he said into the phone's microphone, his voice artificially loud and slow, as if speaking to a child. The phone emitted a tinny, robotic voice in German. The translation was not only literal but clumsy, stripping his words of any nuance and leaving only blunt, arrogant demand. The German industrialist, Hans, did not look at the phone. He looked at Sterling, his blue eyes cold with fury. He responded in a torrent of sharp, precise German. His words were clipped, professional, but carried a clear undercurrent of insult. Sterling held up his phone to translate. The app whirred for a second before spitting out the nonsensical phrase, "Your business practices are a garden of eels." Sterling stared at his phone, baffled. "What the hell is that supposed to mean?" he muttered. His junior executive, Marcus, leaned in. "Sir, I think there might be a technical issue." "There's no issue," Sterling snapped, waving him away. He turned to the Japanese delegation, his face now flushed with irritation. He tried again, speaking even louder this time. "Mr. Tanaka, we are prepared to offer a revised package." The app translated his statement into a Japanese phrase that was technically correct but culturally disastrous. It was the tone a superior would use with a subordinate, a complete violation of etiquette. Mr. Tanaka's polite smile vanished. He gave a short, almost imperceptible bow and took a step back, his disapproval a silent, crushing judgment. The deal was not just dying, it was being ritually executed on the steps of the hotel. Now, desperation began to creep into Sterling's voice. The Russian investor, Dmitry, a large man with a face that looked like it was carved from granite, hadn't said a word. He simply watched, his arms crossed, an impassive observer at a train wreck. He didn't need a translator to understand failure. This is a joke. Sterling finally exploded. He wasn't yelling at his partners anymore, but at the world. He whirled on his own team. A multi-billion-dollar merger, and this is what I get? A children's toy for translation? Who is responsible for this? His wild eyes scanned the terrified faces of his assistants, his lawyers, and his two executives. He was looking for a target, a receptacle for his monumental rage and public failure. And then his gaze fell upon Leo. Leo was standing exactly where he was supposed to be, by the open door of the limousine, his posture perfect, his expression unreadable. He was a small island of calm in a hurricane of chaos. And to Arthur Sterling, that calm was the ultimate insolence. It was the quiet, simple dignity of a man who was supposed to be invisible, a man Sterling had already dismissed as a worthless tool. You! Sterling's voice cracked through the air like a whip. Every head turned. The German, the Japanese, the Russian, the hotel doorman, all stared as the billionaire stormed towards his driver. "What are you looking at?" he bellowed, getting right in Leo's face. Leo did not flinch, did not even blink. He simply met the billionaire's furious gaze. "My life's work is turning to ash right here, and you're just standing there. Are you enjoying the show?" Brian, the second executive, saw his chance to divert the boss's wrath. "He's just the driver, Arthur," he said, his tone a mix of apology and dismissal. "He doesn't understand." "I don't care." Sterling spat, his face inches from Leo's. "He's part of the problem. This incompetence." He waved a hand at Leo's simple uniform, at his calm demeanor. "This is what I'm talking about. People who just stand there, useless, collecting a paycheck. You are a symbol of everything that is wrong with this deal." The public humiliation was complete. In front of the very people he sought to impress, Arthur Sterling was eviscerating a working man who had done nothing wrong. The international partners looked on, their expressions turning from offense to sheer disgust. This was not how a leader behaved. This was a tantrum. Finally, Sterling took a deep breath, trying to regain a shred of control. He turned back to his frantic assistant. "Get me a translator." "Now," he shrieked. He then spun back to Leo, a cruel, mocking sneer twisting his features. "You know what I need, driver? I need 5 languages. At once. I need someone who can speak flawless German, perfect Japanese, fluent Russian, and while we're at it, French and Mandarin for the next meeting. You think you can just pull someone like that out of thin air?" He laughed, a bitter, humorless sound. "Of course you can't." He jabbed a finger into Leo's chest. "Because you're useless. A nobody." He held the pose for a moment, letting his final, venomous judgment hang in the air for all to hear. The challenge, wrapped in layers of scorn and impossibility, had been issued. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the distant sound of city traffic. The deal was dead. Sterling's reputation was shattered. And Leo stood there, the target of it all, with the eyes of the world upon him. "Right here, in this moment of absolute tension, I have to ask you something. Have you ever felt completely underestimated? Judged by your clothes, your job, or your silence, by someone who had no idea who you truly were?" Leo is standing there, holding the dignity of every quiet, overlooked person in his hands. If you believe that a person's true value isn't in how loudly they shout, but in the depths of their character, then take a second to subscribe to this channel. Join our community that honors the silent heroes. Your click tells the world that stories like this matter. Now, let's see what happens next. The silence that followed Sterling's final insult was a physical thing. It was heavier than the humid Geneva air, thicker than the tension between the business delegations. For a single, stretched-out moment, Leo just stood there, absorbing the hateful energy directed at him. His face remained a stoic mask, but in his eyes, a subtle shift occurred. The patient, enduring gaze of a servant was replaced by the focused, analytical look of a master assessing a complex problem. He took one slow, deliberate breath. Then, he moved. It wasn't a flinch or a retreat. It was a single step forward, a pivot on the polished marble. He was no longer positioning himself as a driver, but as a mediator. He turned his body slightly, away from the fuming billionaire, and faced the German industrialist. He inclined his head respectfully. "Herr Hoffmann," Leo began, and the sound that emerged stunned the entire assembly. It was not the accented, hesitant English of a service worker. It was flawless, high German, the crisp, formal dialect of the boardroom, tinged with a faint, authentic Bavarian accent that spoke of old money and elite education. "Verziehen Sie bitte die, Amerikanisch Direktheit." Please, forgive the American directness. In my experience, a passion for efficiency can sometimes be mistaken for a lack of respect. It was not intended as such. Hans Hoffmann's jaw, which had been set in a line of grim fury, went slack. His eyes widened in disbelief. He stared at the man in the simple driver's uniform as if he had just sprouted wings. Arthur Sterling, who had been sneering in triumph, froze. His face cycled through confusion, then shock, then utter bewilderment. "What? What did he just say?" he stammered to Marcus, who could only shake his head, his own face a pale mask of astonishment. Leo continued in German, his tone calm and respectful, but his words carrying an undeniable authority. He addressed Hoffmann's earlier point about market volatility, using complex financial terminology, Kapitalrendite, Risikostreuung, Derivatschaft, with an ease that demonstrated a profound understanding of the issue. He wasn't just translating, he was renegotiating. He was reframing Sterling's clumsy demands into a sophisticated, collaborative proposal. Standing by a nearby pillar, a silver-haired man in a tailored Swiss suit turned to his companion, his hand gripping the other man's arm. He was Antoine Dubois, a retired UN diplomat renowned for his linguistic skills. "Mein Gott," Dubois whispered in French, his voice filled with awe. "That is not just textbook German. He is using the specific cadence and vocabulary of the Munich financial sector. He sounds more German than Hoffmann. Who in God's name is that man?" The companion, equally stunned, could only shrug. The expert validation hung in the air, an unspoken testament to the miracle they were witnessing. Before Sterling could utter another word, Leo pivoted again, this time to face the Japanese delegation. He performed a bow, not the clumsy, mocking one Sterling had attempted, but a perfect, precise bow of respect, back straight, eyes lowered, hands correctly placed. He rose and began to speak in Japanese. The transformation was absolute. The crisp, hard sounds of German were replaced by the softer, more nuanced tones of formal Japanese, or Kigo. "Tanaka-sama," Leo said, his voice imbued with a quiet humility that was the exact antidote to Sterling's earlier aggression. He addressed the cultural offense directly but with immense subtlety. He spoke of the shared desire for a long-term partnership, Suenegai Atsukiai, and how sometimes different paths can lead to the same peak of the mountain. He took Sterling's raw, transactional offer and wrapped it in the delicate paper of mutual honor and shared prosperity. Mr. Tanaka, who had been the picture of offended dignity, blinked. His entire posture softened. He leaned forward slightly, captivated. He replied with a question in Japanese, a technical query about intellectual property rights. Sterling and his team stood by, useless and mute, as this impossible conversation unfolded. They were no longer participants, they were spectators at their own deal, which was being saved by a man they had dismissed as furniture. The spectacle continued, a masterclass in diplomacy performed on a public stage. Leo turned to the imposing Russian, Dmitri, who had been watching with cold, detached amusement. The shift in language was again instantaneous and total. His voice took on the rich, resonant baritone of the Russian language, and he spoke with the direct, no-nonsense formality that he knew a man like Dmitri would respect. He didn't apologize or make excuses for Sterling. Instead, he spoke of strategic partnership and mutual benefit, cutting directly to the core of the Russians' interests. Dmitri's impassive expression didn't change, but he gave a single, slow nod. In his world, that was the equivalent of a standing ovation. Arthur Sterling's universe had completely inverted. The rigid hierarchy he lived by, where wealth equaled intelligence and status equaled worth, had crumbled to dust. The man he had screamed at, the man he had publicly debased, was now effortlessly commanding the respect of the very people he had failed to impress. He was a ghost at his own feast. How, he whispered to no one in particular. How is this possible? He's a driver. The words sounded hollow, a desperate mantra against a reality he could no longer deny. His power, his money, his booming voice, all were utterly impotent. Leo held all the power now, and his power was quiet, earned, and absolute. A fourth man, a French banker who had been standing with Hoffman's group, stepped forward and interjected with a rapid-fire question in French about the deal's complex financing structure across different European Union tax laws. Without a moment's hesitation, Leo replied in the fluid, sophisticated French of the Parisian financial world, discussing EU regulations and cross-border transactions as if he were reading from a textbook. It was then that the final partner, a Chinese investor named Mr. Chen who had remained in the background, made his move. He saw the deal being salvaged and wanted to test the limits of this miracle worker. He strode forward and spoke in sharp, fast Mandarin, asking a highly specific question about supply chain logistics and tariffs related to the Shanghai Free Trade Zone. The assembled crowd held its breath. Surely, this was a bridge too far. But Leo simply turned to Mr. Chen, a calm focus in his eyes, and replied in flawless Mandarin. He didn't just answer the question, he expanded on it, suggesting a more efficient shipping route and referencing a recent, obscure change in provincial import regulations. That was the breaking point. The charade of Sterling being in charge was over. The partners now bypassed the billionaire completely. They formed a tight circle around Leo, firing questions at him in their native tongues. The scene was breathtaking. A German industrialist, a Japanese tech mogul, a Russian oligarch, a French banker, and a Chinese investor, all huddled around a man in a driver's uniform, who acted as the central hub of a high-stakes, five-language negotiation. Marcus and Brian, the sycophantic executives, tried to push their way into the circle, to look relevant. Arthur, perhaps we should, Marcus began, but his voice trailed off as he realized no one was listening. They looked to their boss for a signal, for some command, but Sterling was paralyzed, his face ashen. He looked like a king who had just discovered his entire kingdom was built on sand. What unfolded next was not merely translation, it was artistry. Leo was a conductor orchestrating a symphony of commerce and culture. He would take a concern from Hoffman about German labor laws, instantly cross-reference it with Tanaka's query about production timelines, and articulate a solution in Japanese that honored their just-in-time manufacturing philosophy. He would hear Dimitri's grumbled Russian comment about raw material sourcing and immediately connect it to Mr. Chen's point in Mandarin about tariff avoidance, weaving them together into a coherent strategy. He was a living bridge between worlds, closing the gaps that Sterling's arrogance had blasted open. His mind worked with a speed and clarity that was almost superhuman, each word chosen with the precision of a surgeon. The retired diplomat, Antoine Dubois, was now scribbling furiously on the back of a hotel receipt. "It's phenomenal," he murmured to his companion. "He's not just switching languages, he's switching cultural identities. He's using German bluntness to convey strength, Japanese humility to show respect, Russian stoicism to build trust. This is not a skill one learns. This is a gift. A work of pure genius." After nearly 15 minutes of this intense, impromptu summit, a breakthrough occurred. Hans Hoffmann silenced the group. He looked past Sterling, directly at Leo, and spoke in clear, deliberate English for everyone to hear. "Sir," he said, the honorific delivered with profound sincerity. "You have clarified the structural framework with exceptional skill. We are prepared to move forward." Mr. Tanaka then bowed deeply, not to Sterling, but to Leo. "We are grateful for your wisdom and respect." Dimitri gave his firm nod, this time accompanied by a rare glint of admiration in his eyes. The deal, which had been dead just minutes earlier, had been resurrected. The partners, now a united front, turned and walked into the hotel to formalize the agreement, talking amongst themselves in a quiet, respectful buzz. The storm had passed. The chaos was over. Left on the grand steps were Leo, Arthur Sterling, and his two shell-shocked executives. The silence that returned was different. It was not tense, but heavy with the weight of what had just transpired. Sterling stared at Leo, his face a canvas of shattered pride and raw disbelief. The sneer was gone, the rage extinguished, replaced by a hollow, gaping void. Finally, he found his voice. It was not a roar, but a choked, broken whisper. "Who are you?" Leo turned to face him fully. His expression was not triumphant, not smug, not angry. It was simply calm, the placid look of a man who knew his own worth and had no need to broadcast it. He met the billionaire's gaze and held it. "My name is Leo," he said, his voice even and quiet. "I am your driver." The simplicity of the statement was devastating. It was not an accusation, but a fact that dismantled Sterling's entire worldview. Leo had won, not by fighting, but by being purely and completely himself. He held Sterling's gaze for a moment longer, then added softly, "You asked for a translator, sir. Service has been rendered." Then, in a final, masterful display of his own code of conduct, Leo turned away from the broken billionaire, walked back to the limousine, opened the passenger door, and stood at attention, resuming his professional stance, ready to chauffeur the man he had just so thoroughly and elegantly destroyed. The world came back into focus slowly for Arthur Sterling. The polite applause for the departing delegates from inside the hotel lobby seemed to mock him. The hotel staff, the doormen and valets who had witnessed his tirade, no longer looked at him with the deferential fear he commanded. They looked past him, their gazes fixed on the quiet man in the driver's uniform with an expression of profound, unadulterated respect. Sterling saw it all in a blur of shame. The hierarchy had been inverted. In their eyes, Leo was the man of substance, and he, the billionaire, was nothing more than a loud, embarrassing child. His two executives, Marcus and Brian, finally found their voices. "Arthur, the delegates are waiting inside," Marcus stammered, his face pale. We should go in." But Sterling couldn't move. He couldn't bring himself to get back into that limousine. To be enclosed in a small space with the man who had so effortlessly dismantled his entire sense of self was an unbearable thought. Without a word, he turned his back on Leo, on the car, on his public humiliation, and stumbled toward the hotel entrance, a defeated emperor abandoning his chariot. His executives scurried after him, their own faces burning with a shame that was rapidly curdling into fear for their jobs. Leo watched them go. There was no triumph in his eyes, no satisfaction. He simply observed their retreat with the same calm focus he had applied to the negotiation. When they were gone, he closed the rear passenger door. The soft, solid click was the only sound in the now quiet driveway. It sounded like a final judgment. He walked around the car, slid into the driver's seat, and placed his hands on the wheel, his posture perfect. He was a driver, waiting for his passenger. His victory was not in a grand gesture, but in this quiet, unwavering return to his own code. Before he could put the car in gear, there was a soft tap on his window. It was the elderly Swiss diplomat, Antoine Dubois. Leo lowered the window. "Monsieur," Dubois said in perfect, sonorous French, his eyes shining with admiration. "I was a United Nations ambassador for 40 years. I have witnessed negotiations between heads of state, generals, and revolutionaries. I can tell you, without hyperbole, that what you did here today was one of the purest acts of diplomacy I have ever seen. It was an honor." A flicker of a genuine, small smile touched Leo's lips. It was the first time his professional mask had slipped. "Merci, monsieur," he replied in the same language. "I was simply ensuring communication was clear. It is, after all, my job." The diplomat smiled back, understanding the profound humility in that statement. He nodded and walked away, leaving Leo in the quiet solitude of his vehicle. But the story did not stay in the quiet driveway. It spread, carried by the dozens who had witnessed it. Dubois recounted the tale of the linguistic driver at a diplomatic dinner that evening, where it was met with astonishment and delight. The hotel staff traded the story in hushed, excited tones. But the most potent version came from an unexpected source. One of Sterling's junior analysts, a young man who had watched his boss's cruelty with growing disgust, had discreetly filmed the last 2 minutes of Leo's performance on his phone. That evening, racked with a crisis of conscience, he sent the video and an anonymous, detailed account of Sterling's initial meltdown to a well-known financial blogger. The consequences began before the ink was dry on the newly saved deal. The first to fall were the sycophants. News of Sterling's public incident reached the board of directors through unofficial channels within hours. An emergency virtual meeting was convened. Faced with a brewing PR nightmare, they needed a sacrifice. Marcus and Brian were the perfect offerings. They were summoned to a video call with the COO and summarily fired for gross incompetence in managing logistical support for a key international merger, a corporate phrase that meant, "You let the boss make a fool of himself and did nothing to stop it." Their careers, built on the rickety foundation of pleasing an arrogant man, were vaporized in an instant. For Sterling, the reckoning was just beginning. By the time he woke up in his penthouse suite the next morning, the story was everywhere. The blogger's post, titled "The Billionaire's Meltdown and the Driver Who Spoke 5 Languages," had gone viral. The grainy phone footage was attached. It didn't need to show Sterling screaming fit, it only needed to show the aftermath, the circle of powerful men, hanging on the driver's every word. The narrative was explosive. Arthur Sterling, the tech visionary, the master of the universe, was portrayed as a helpless, incompetent fool, saved from his own ignorance by the very man he abused. His company's stock plunged 7% in pre-market trading, wiping out over $1 billion of value before the opening bell. His phone was exploding with calls from his board, from investors, from the press. But he answered none of them. He just sat there, in the silent, opulent suite, the echo of a quiet driver's voice ringing in his ears. The consequences for Arthur Sterling were not a flash flood, but a slow, rising tide that drowned his career. The viral video was only the beginning. In the days that followed, the story evolved. It ceased to be a funny anecdote and became a case study in corporate rot. Business publications wrote scathing editorials, not just about Sterling's personal behavior, but about the toxic bully boss culture he represented. The narrative he had so carefully crafted, that of a ruthless but effective genius, was replaced by a new one, that of a reckless, arrogant manchild who nearly destroyed his own company's future and had to be saved by a humble driver. The board of directors, initially hoping the scandal would blow over, found themselves backed into a corner. Major institutional investors, who managed pension funds and endowments, began issuing public statements expressing deep concern over the company's leadership and governance. It was a death sentence in corporate language. The international partners, whom Leo had so skillfully brought back to the table, formally paused the merger, citing the reputational risk of associating with Sterling. The deal Leo had saved became the very weapon used against its architect. Exactly 1 week after his meltdown in Geneva, Arthur Sterling was forced to resign. The press release spoke of him stepping down to pursue other interests, but the truth was an open secret in the financial world. He was in exile from his own empire. The man who saw human beings as disposable tools had been, in the end, disposed of. He vanished from the public eye, his name becoming a verb in business schools. To be Sterling meant to have one's own arrogance lead to a catastrophic, public downfall. The justice was poetic. He wasn't defeated by a rival billionaire or a market crash, but by the quiet, unassailable dignity of a man he had deemed worthless. And what of Leo? The world wanted to make him a star. The limousine company he worked for, besieged by positive press for the first time in its history, immediately offered him a promotion. Head of Client Relations for Ultra-High Net Worth Individuals, the title read. It came with a corner office and a salary triple his current wage. News channels from CNN to the BBC hounded him, offering fortunes for a single televised interview. A book publisher offered him a handsome advance to write a memoir, The Driver's Seat, My Life in Languages. Leo listened to all the offers with his usual quiet politeness. And he turned every single one of them down. "Thank you, but I am a driver," he explained to his baffled manager. "I enjoy my work. The road, the quiet, the focus. This is where I belong. He had no desire for an office, no need for the validation of fame. His life was already perfectly calibrated to his own needs. He had his small, peaceful apartment, his endless supply of books, and the quiet satisfaction of a job done with honor. He made only one request. "I would prefer," he said softly, "not to be assigned to Mr. Sterling in the future." The final scene of the story unfolds a month later, long after the news cycle has moved on. It is a quiet Sunday morning in Leo's apartment. Sunlight streams through the clean window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Leo sits at his small kitchen table, just as he did at the start of that fateful day. In front of him is a cup of black coffee and a new textbook, its spine barely creased. The title is Introduction to Swahili Grammar. His phone doesn't ring. There are no reporters outside his door. The world has forgotten him, and he is grateful for it. On a small bookshelf, next to volumes in Russian, Arabic, and Korean, sits a single, small framed photograph of a smiling woman with kind eyes, standing in front of a university blackboard covered in linguistic charts. He glances at it, and the small, contented smile returns to his lips. He was not a mystery. He was a legacy. He had not needed that day in Geneva to know his own worth. His value was never dependent on Sterling's approval or the world's applause. The battle wasn't won when the billionaire fell silent. It had been won every morning for the past 30 years when he polished his shoes, ironed his uniform, and opened a book. The quiet dignity of his life was his true victory, a fortress that no amount of arrogance or scorn could ever breach. He took a sip of his coffee, turned the page, and began to learn a new world. Leo's story is a powerful reminder that your true worth is not determined by someone else's opinion. It is forged in your quiet moments, in your secret passions, and in the dignity you carry when no one is watching. The world is full of loud voices demanding to be heard, but often, the most incredible skills and the strongest characters are the ones that don't feel the need to shout. We all have a talent the world might not see. What's your hidden skill? What's that part of you that gives you quiet strength? Share it in the comments below. Let's build a community that celebrates the unseen value in each of us. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe and turn on notifications. You'll be the first to know when we share another story about the quiet heroes who walk among us. Thank you for watching.